Good afternoon and very warm welcome. India's Primer Electronics Association, ICA, in collaboration with ICRIAR, has prepared a detailed report on Globalise to Localise. Exporting at scale and deepening the ecosystem are vital to higher domestic value addition in electronics. This report draws inspiration from competing economies like Vietnam and China, which have successfully exported electronics items valued at $100 billion and $900 billion respectively, while India is stuck at $10 to $15 billion. The research suggests two major objectives: scaling up exports to the global market, that is Globalize, and increasing the proportion of domestic value addition, that is Localize. It's our pleasure to thank Shri Rajeev Chandrasekhar, Minister of State for IT, Electronics, Entrepreneurship and Skill Development for this report launch, sir. We are glad to have you. I request Shri Pankaj Mohindru, Chairman, India Cellular and Electronics Association, to give his opening remarks. Sir, please.
Honorable Rajiv ji, Mr. Satya Prakash, Principal DG, Marwa ji, and Deepak Mishra, CEO of ICRIA. So you would remember, friends, that we came out with two vision reports which were launched by the Honorable Minister a few months back, which was Vision Report 1 and 2, which had this audacious $300 billion number by 2025-6, that we have to achieve that. Now, as a consequence of that, what ICA has been doing is we've been putting together the building blocks of how this is going to happen, right? Which is that first, all the verticals, mobile phones, you would admit that there are some tailwinds and, we are on some trajectory. The others, IT hardware, consumer electronics, hearable wearables, and other electronics, auto electronics, etc. All that strategies are being put in place. And we find that the pace is very feverish at the moment, and the Honorable Minister has a day clock ticking in his office, so every time we go there, we get more anxious because the number of days are coming to an end almost. So, but I think what is happening is that the building blocks, for example, this report is a building block towards this vision, which is that we are competing against two very giant economies, China and Vietnam, who are very strong in electronics. So the boldness of facing this in the face, that we have achieved so much, this 1,500% growth over the last 5-6 years in mobile phone manufacturing, and but the restlessness for growth is so profound that nobody is sitting on that. Policies to learn from these giants and how to meet that challenge is what is in this report. My colleague, my friend Deepak Mishra from ICRIA will give you a detailed presentation, and thank you very much for coming here. Deepak, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pankaj. His Excellency Minister Shri Rajeev Chandrasekhar ji, Mr. Pankaj Mohindru, fellow panelists, friends from industry, media, ladies and gentlemen. When many developing countries have surrendered to the idea of premature deindustrialization, that is that they cannot industrialize like the way the industrial countries did for 2 centuries, India appears to be on a cusp of a manufacturing revival. As this slide shows, a number of enabling trade and industrial policies at home and the growing fragility of the supply chains abroad have meant that global electronic firms are looking to India to diversify the manufacturing base and source of their exports. The report that we are presenting today draws on the experience of successful exporting nations and provides certain ideas on how India can achieve the size and pace of exports attended by China and Vietnam. We are grateful to Rajeev ji for writing the foreword and to ICA for funding this study. India needs a manufacturing renaissance to create the necessary jobs for the youth of this country. But this is not going to be easy, and we know that. It's a very bold step on part of the government because the ground realities are not always favorable to us. So just look at some of these numbers that I have on the screen. Our electronic exports have increased by threefold from 5.8 billion to 16 billion in the last 7 years, but yet Vietnam export 8 times more electronics products than us, and China does 60 times. India and Vietnam, if you look at the right graph, were at the same level of exports in 2010. But then India had its 2G scandal, we had the Nokia closure of factories, and our exports plummeted. It is not a coincidence that exactly at this time, Samsung was setting up its shop in Vietnam. As a matter of pure coincidence, I was actually living and working in Hanoi during 2010 and 30 and saw it in firsthand how Vietnam got transformed from almost no exports in electronics to a global hub for electronics exports. Thankfully, India's electronic export, while small, is starting to show strong revival. So if you look at this picture on the left, you see the dots when it was a trough, which is around the 2014-15, the closure of the Nike factory, when our electronics and the manufacturing was all slumping. Since then, we see a steady revival, and some of these numbers actually outdated. The 2020, 21, 22 are even higher than what I have on that picture. At the same time, if you look at the right picture, it shows the share of domestic value addition remains modest. And this report is actually about how do we increase the domestic value addition and what are the things we can learn from the East Asian countries. There are other important reasons why we want to revive the electronic sectors. It is one of the largest contributor to country's trade deficit. If you see the picture, you see the trade balance or the trade deficit continues to slide downward, and this can be reversed. And we believe that electronic sector can become a source of trade surplus one day. But the most important reason why we want to revive the electric sector is because of jobs. Today, we have 210,000 people who are directly employed in the sector compared to 1.4 million in China. Sorry, that's not today, that's in 2018. That's the latest data that we have. Today, there are much more, but this is direct jobs. And we believe, and the GOI is committed to create more jobs in the sector, and we think this is absolutely possible, that we could actually hit a very large number of jobs and create good jobs in the electronic sectors. To create jobs, we need more aggregate domestic value addition. And aggregate domestic value addition is, if you really think about it, is the total domestic value addition that you put into exports. So it's a dollar number or a rupee that we are thinking about. And it's a simple multiplication of two things: how much you export and how much local contents that's get added to each unit of export. So India could produce one smartphone and have 100% domestic addition versus 3 smartphones with 33% domestic value addition. And in theory, both will create exactly the same employment effect and growth effect. So let's assume that in this picture, India is at point A. So we are today, our DVA ratio is 18%. Our exports of smartphones is, let's say, 16 billion. And we want to go to C. And C is the 120 billion that we have set our target. And let's say the DVA ratio is going to be 40%, for example. And the most efficient part to go there is from A to C is a straight line. At least that seems like the most obvious thing to do. So you globalize and localize at the same time. You go both on the x-axis and the y-axis to the northeast. But there are many paths to go from A to C. Rather than using the theory, what we like to use to look at the data and the evidence to see what did successful exporting nations have done to increase aggregate DVA. Did they increase export? Did they increase the domestic value addition ratio? Or did they do both? And so this picture shows you that domestic value addition ratio, which is how much local contents we are adding in each smartphone or in each electronics product, is about 18% for India, which is lower than Vietnam, which is 24, and China is 38. So clearly we need to have more domestic value addition as we go forward. So you want to move on the x-axis. We also want to move on the y-axis, which is where you want to have more exports. But what's interesting is when you compare this DVA ratio across all the countries that we could find data on, and the China, India, Vietnam is highlighted more, what you find is that in India it has been fairly constant over time, whereas in case of China and Vietnam, there's been fairly dynamic. In both the cases, the DVA ratio fell initially. So in China, it fell all the way to below India level, and in Vietnam, it fell all the way to 17%. And then steadily increase. And China has been much more successful in adding, increasing its domestic value ratio than Vietnam. But if you look at it, India actually always had a low ratio, but it has been fairly constant over time. So I think that tells you that the DVA ratio itself is not a static number. It does change. And the question is, how do you do that? How do you change it? So this shows what happens in a long term, in a long-term story. So the x-axis is what is the DVA ratio, and the y-axis is how much you are exporting. And what you see is Vietnam in 2000 starts at a quadrant, which is very high DVA ratio and very low exports. And over time, it goes up, and it goes, so it decreases the DVO, increases scale, and by 2020, it's on the top end of the picture. Whereas India has actually started with a very low DVA and very low exports base. It went up, but actually first it did was it increases DVA ratio, so this must have happened in the early 2000s, and then we got stuck at a much lower level. So how do you change these statistics? And at what point do you focus from increasing your exports to going to both? And this picture gives you a bit of an idea that if you look at it in the beginning, the line is very straight. So you are actually keeping your DVA ratio constant, but your exports goes up pretty dramatically. And then as you reach a point, and in case of India, we think it's somewhere between $30 and $70 billion, then it starts to change. And then you move into a ratio where you're starting to increase your domestic value addition more than your exports. So let me quickly, I know I don't have much time, and all of you will have to read the report to get to the more details, but this is a very important slide, the first two slides saying the DVA and the export scales can move negatively in the short run, but positively in the long run. And the fact that the inflection point is about $30 to $40 billion in case of in globally or India is when you start to focus on both and not in the very beginning. But so what do you do with this, with the policies? I think that's what I want to focus on. So we think India should able to adopt some of the same ideas that the East Asian countries have done, which is basically first increase the scale, and then when you achieve the threshold level of scale, starts to focus on both. Such an approach would not make sense for agriculture products or for gems and jewelry, which are not highly GVC dependent, but it certainly makes a lot of sense for electronics products. So this is a special case for a special sector, which should not be thought of as applicable to everything that we're talking about. So to go from point A to C, we believe, based on the evidence, the right line is not a straight line, but actually perhaps from A to B and then B to C, or if you think of more incrementally, going slowly first up the y-axis, then the x-axis. So what are the policies that we think could help us in the electronics sector to first increase scale, then increase domestic value addition? I think I'd like to think of you start from the bottom of this slide. Think of the policies which are important for both scale and local contents. So if you look at it, where it comes to macro stability, competitive exchange rate, ease of doing business, reducing logistic costs like Gati Shakti, these are important for both. Whether you want scale, whether you want a DVA ratio, you should focus on those. So that's very important. But then you need to understand what policies will have what impact and how does this policy have to be strategically sequenced into the implementation phase. So we think 1 plus 3 is when you are really focusing on the scale effect. So the first would be about promoting more regional trade agreements, rolling back some of the custom duties, suspending some of the local content requirement, allowing imports from lowest cost place and forms and countries, and targeted and temporary fiscal incentives like PLI program. But once you have the scale, then you got to move on all three. So 1, 2, 3 should be started. So when it comes to local contents, it's about developing a domestic ecosystem that involves a strategy. It involves technological upgradation, sourcing fairs, supporting industry development program, and workers training at scale. And remember, these policies take a lot more time to get implemented, so you need to start working on them right away. So even if the local contents might kick in 3 years, 4 years down the road, the actual work and the policies have to start right away. And I'll take 1 minute to just give you a little bit more depth into what kind of policies that Vietnam did when it was about deepening the ancillary ecosystem. So if you look at the picture, it says that in 2009, Samsung entered Vietnam with a $670 million investment. By 2012, Samsung seemed that this is a great investment. They wanted to expand. They started with the R&D facilities. In 2014, Samsung had 67 suppliers, out of which only 4 were Vietnamese. Rest all were foreigners, foreign firms. But by 2017, out of those 25 suppliers which are tier 1, only 5 were domestic. But by 2019, that 5 became 42. So what did that happen over the time period that they could actually get so many tier 1 suppliers from Vietnam? So the right side picture tells you exactly what they did. So in 2014, they actually started with Samsung announced a collaboration with Vietnamese government in holding a sourcing fair. Vietnamese firms were invited to present their product offerings, sourcing policy, and potential special components for outsourcing purpose. 2015, they had introduced a 3-month technical consultation for existing and potential Vietnamese suppliers, and this covered initial technical assessment of the firms, followed by interviews and hands-on collaboration with key personnel on production flows to improve the firm's manufacturing process. Samsung provided the guidance on application process and requirement for becoming a Samsung supplier. By 2016, the government announced a supporting industry development program that involved domestic supply firms in serving domestic production as well as for GBCs, and connected supporting industry enterprise to become product suppliers for domestic and foreign customers. By 2019, the government and Samsung together completed a training course of 207 Vietnamese consultants. So they moved from Korean consultant to Vietnamese consultant, and they went on to teach the other local firms. So the bottom line is creating a competitive ecosystem. Domestic suppliers takes time, effort, but it is absolutely doable, and Vietnam actually shows the way. I think in case India, there are already things in offing, which makes me feel very confident that we should be able to do that. So in summary, the focus of policy should be to increase aggregate domestic value addition, because that's where you create jobs. This can be achieved through either more exports or more DVA ratio, or both. The relationship between scale and the ratio is not static. It evolves over time. In the initial years, the evidence seems to suggest that it's negative, but in the medium to long term, they can move together. Successful electronic exporting nations have pursued a sequential approach of first achieving scale, then increasing local contents. The report points to an urgent need for India to create a competitive domestic ecosystem of suppliers through technology upgradation, sourcing fairs, introducing supporting industry development programs. In short, our study recommends trade and industrial policies for transforming India from a moderate to a major exporter of electronics. Encouragingly, the government has already considered many of these moves, and Honorable Minister will talk about some of those things, to both broaden and deepen the sector. We remain highly optimistic about the future of India's electronic sector. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, sir, for the articulate presentation. Now I request Shri S.K. Marwa, Group Coordinator, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, to give his address remarks.
Honorable Minister of State for Electronics and IT, Mr. Satyendra Prakash, Principal DG, PIB, Mr. Deepak Mishra, ICRAIR, Mr. Pankaj Mahindru, Chairman, ICIA, leaders of the industry and members of the media present here. Good afternoon, everyone. I extend a very warm welcome to all of you from the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology at the launch of ICRAIR ICIA report titled Globalise to Localise, of which Mr. Deepak Mishra has given us an overview. At the outset, I would like to congratulate ICIA for this very timely report. Today, we are at the cusp of a robust growth in domestic electronics manufacturing. We have set up a very ambitious target of electronics manufacturing of US dollar 300 billion annual production by 2026, up from the current US dollar 76 billion. To achieve this target, we need to focus on size and scale, and at the same time, broaden and deepen our electronics manufacturing ecosystem. For increasing the domestic value addition, we started with the introduction of a phased manufacturing program for mobile phones and its parts inputs, which has shown excellent results since 2017. This phased manufacturing program has now been extended to several electronic products. We introduced the modified special incentive package scheme, which provided capex subsidy of 20 to 25% for both electronic products as well as components. Thereafter, under the aegis of National Policy on Electronics 2019, we introduced the production-linked incentive scheme for large-scale mobile manufacturing and electronic components, followed by a PLI scheme for IT hardware. Parallelly, to increase domestic value addition with focus on promoting electronic components manufacturing, we introduced the scheme for promotion of manufacturing of electronic components and semiconductors, SPECS, which provides a fiscal incentive of 25% on the capital equipment cost. To promote semiconductors and display manufacturing, we have introduced a very ambitious rupees 76,000 crore semiconductor program, which is focusing on promoting both semiconductor and display fabs, as well as compound semiconductor fabs, the ATMP OSAT units, as well as providing design-linked incentives. So with all that, we are at an inflection point, as Mr. Deepak Mishra said, and we look forward to participation of all of you in achieving this ambitious target of 300 billion electronics production by 2026. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful words. Now I request Shri Rajeev Chandrasekhar, Honorable Minister of State, Electronics and IT, Entrepreneurship and Skill Development, to give his remarks.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Deepak. Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you, Satendra ji, and of course my colleagues from METI, including Mr. Marwa. This is the third time I'm sitting on this platform and talking about electronics over the last, let's say, 10 months. And we have, I think, succeeded in systematically building a framework and a strategy that has clearly outlined our goals of a $300 billion electronics manufacturing ecosystem with $120 billion of exports by the year 2026. As I think somebody mentioned, it was either Deepak or Pankaj, that electronics in India has traveled a long way since 2014. In 2014, this was a moribund industry, racked by and, in a sense, ravaged by FTAs and a reasonably senseless import policy, leaving us extremely vulnerable to imports and dependence on imports on the fastest growing segment of the domestic economy after hydrocarbons and petroleum, which is electronics. So we were, in 2014, a country that was increasingly dependent not just on petroleum imports, but also on the electronics imports. And systematically, Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji, over the years, has built back an electronics sector. And today we are, as a consequence of the number of policies that Mr. Marwa talked about, we are a $75 billion, $76 billion if you count the last billion, $76 billion manufacturing economy with $16 billion of exports, with a target of 21 to $25 billion of exports in the next year. But most importantly, by 26, we have clearly laid out a goal of $300 billion of manufacturing with $120 billion of exports. That strategy, apart from just the numbers, and some of you may have seen this, some of you may have read these 2 volumes of documents, talks about the broadening and deepening of the electronics segment. So we have obviously been very successful in the mobile and cellular sector, but we want to broaden the product categories and also deepen the ecosystem of components and other inputs that go into electronics. So the broadening and deepening is what will take us to this $300 billion and $120 billion. So I think this report by ICRIER, and I have written out a forward for those who are interested in understanding my detailed, granular views on this report. There's a forward of mine in the report. But I will explain to you how I see this report. It is an interesting, is a very important and a very interesting element that describes, in some sense, what our strategy will be for the next few years. That electronics is about scale. You know, China does $900 billion of exports. The global value chains today for electronics is about $1.5 trillion. It is clear that this is a business of volumes. This is a business of scale. And our electronics ecosystem has to reach the scale, and hence we have that number of 300 billion and 120 billion. The second important element here is that the value chains of electronics around the world post-COVID are undergoing deep tectonic, irreversible changes. That presents to India and the current momentum and opportunity, which is explained by the $120 billion export target that we have for 2026. That opportunity is an opportunity that will be fiercely contested. There will be other geographies and countries that will contest that opportunity. But that opportunity is an opportunity that we believe, and we have clearly sees this, and when I say we, it is we and the government and the industry working together. We see this as an opportunity for the next 2 or 3 years as the value chains start continue the shift and complete the shift and the redesign and re-architecture. This report, in a nutshell, leaves us with this view, which is that the opportunity is real. The numbers that we have set out in the volume 1 and volume 2 of vision are doable and deliverable, and we can and we must reach them. But that the postulation in this report is that we must export aggressively to reach the scales, in addition to domestic production and domestic supplies and domestic consumption, that exports are a very important way to get the scales of the other economies that are competing with us. That is the first takeout of this, and that exports will create an almost network effect or a knockdown effect of creating the supply chains interest, the supply chain investments, that in turn will increase value addition in the Indian electronics segment. So while Deepak, being an economist, will use a lot of log graphs, and that is obviously that's what economists do, and I have no grudge against that. But I just wanted to distill it down in plain English for those who are interested in understanding what this tells us about our strategy, that I think in a lot of ways it validates what the government of India is trying to do, which is to really encourage and grow exports, given the fact that this market opportunity, supply chain opportunity of change exists. And that in turn will create the supply chain investments that we seek from our domestic players, the growth of our domestic players, and other overseas investments into supply chain that will in effect give the value addition increase that we seek for any activity that is the legitimate outcome that we seek. Mr. Marwa talked about the semiconductor policy. I think semiconductor is the icing on the cake, because when we talk about value addition, we talk about scale. An electronics industry of scale, an electronics industry that is headed in the direction of significant value addition domestically because of the scale, also lends itself well in terms of creating a very viable and robust semiconductor ecosystem that in turn feeds the electronics industry. So I will leave it at that. I again thank you, ICA. I thank ICRIER. ICA has been a good, solid partner into the government's own ability to intellectually plan this, think this through. It is a very important thing. Reports sometimes are discounted in Delhi because they're pieces of paper that people seldom read. But these reports have played a seminal role in creating an all-of-government awareness to the opportunity that the electronics manufacturing, the global GVC changes represent, and also create an all-of-government awareness of what policy actions are required to make India's ambitions successful. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much again, and Jai Hind.
Thank you so much for your visionary words. I request everyone to unveil the report, please. Thank you. Now I request Shri Satyendra Prakash, Principal DG PIB, to give his remarks and address the media.
Good afternoon, friends. We have invited you on this occasion of the release of this very important report, and we have with us the Honorable Minister of State for Electronics, IT, and Entrepreneurship and Skill Development, Shri Rajeev Chandrasekhar ji. I extend you a very warm welcome on behalf of PIB, sir. We also have representatives of ICA and ICRIAR, and also the scientists from MIT with us. Now you have seen the report which has been released, and there had been a detailed presentation. The floor is now open for the question answer, and whatever doubts you have, Honorable Minister will try to clarify that. Yeah, 100.
Hi, good afternoon. Ashmit from CNBC TV 18. A couple of things stand out, sir, as a part of this ICRIA report. Number one is that in the push for greater globalization and a greater share of the export pie, it would require for dilution of two aspects. Number one would be the localization norms to be diluted, at least in the short run. And the other is a number of tariff lines have higher customs as compared to those charged by countries that we compared it to, which is Vietnam and China. So in the short term, can that consensus be developed within the government to allow for these two reliefs?
No, so like I said, Ashmit, in my statements, I think these are legitimate findings by ICRIAR. It's a study, not somebody's intuition or somebody's gut feel. So we will, look, our ambitions, our goals are very clear. And if this document, in my opinion, is a legitimate input into that strategy. If the strategy needs us to look at scale versus value addition as a real discussion, we will look at it. It is clear in our mind that these are correlated issues, that value addition or margins, as in some other language, is an issue that is important, because value addition tells you about how much value you are adding in a country. If it is just simply no value addition, there's no point, there's no economic activity arising out of it. So we are interested in, our ambitions are significant value addition to whatever we do in the digital space in this country, in our country. But ICRIAR has pointed out that there is a way to that needs to be navigated through maybe lower margins or lower value addition in the early stages, while the supply chain builds up. And it's something that we will look at, we'll examine. Yeah. Go ahead, I can hear you anyway, go ahead.
Supplementary question that one would understand that the exercise of any such authority by the government will require multiple ministries. I would think off the top of my head, commerce, finance, MIT. Does that make the challenge, make it more challenging?
Which is the point I mentioned, that while Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology is the administrative ministry, and we would like to take credit for all good things that happen in the digital space, but really this is about all of government. Everything that we do today is very well coordinated with the Ministries of Commerce and Industry, the Ministries of Finance, the Prime Minister's Office, Niti Aayog. So there are many parts of the government that are involved in this ambition that the Prime Minister has set out for us of being a significant player in the electronics value chain in the coming years. So this cannot be done by MIT alone. And we make we are not delusional, or we make no claim to that at all. So it is absolutely an all-of-government approach.
Hi, good evening, sir. Danish Anand from ET Now. Sir, in your address, you mentioned about the right timing as far as boosting the exports.
Where are you? Which
so
side
this
are you?
side, sir.
Okay.
This side. Yes, sir. So in your address, you mentioned that this is the right time for us to push our electronics exports as well as the manufacturing. So as far as the semiconductor PLI scheme is concerned, so it's been quite some months. What is the progress on that, and when can we see the ball rolling on that front?
Look, it's significant time. I don't know on what measure is it significant time. The policy was announced in December 2021. We are 7 months, 8 months down the road, and we are very close to completing the evaluation of these proposals that have been submitted. As you know, semiconductors are not a simple investment proposal, and there are many, many aspects of every semiconductor proposal that needs to be gotten into, and there is a very, very comprehensive global standard advisory committee that is working with the India Semiconductor Mission, and we will hear from them soon.
Hi, sir. Good afternoon. I'm Ashish from ET. So I want to ask that once you focus on a policy of globalizing first and then localizing while the value chains and the other systems build. So does this mean that we'll see a greater share of exports in the 300 billion target that you set till 2026?
Again, I want to make it clear that this is not I'm not saying that this is a document that is a government document. This is a submission, this is a set of ideas from ICA and ICRIER to the government that suggests, and I want you to understand this very carefully, that the road to value addition is via globalization, via more exports. That is the postulation, that is the basic point that they're making. It is not an A follows B as you have characterized. What you're saying is, will you export more and then add value? It's not sequential in that sense. But in the overall framework, exports are as important, the push for exports are as important as domestic manufacturing and the overall manufacturing to be able to ensure that the supply chains grow and value addition increases. I want to make it very clear. My understanding from this is not that they are asking us to sequence it, saying get to $120 billion of exports and then worry about supply chains. That is not how I see it. I see it as we need scale. This is a $1.5 trillion game, electronics. India needs to scale and we need to reach $300 billion fast. Exports are a very, very important element of that, which we have already clarified because we have said $120 billion of that $300 billion is exports. And I'll tell you what that $120 billion means. In 22-23, we will be at about 25, maybe marginally more than $25 billion in exports. So the jump is from 27 billions to 120 billion. Neither is it a small jump or neither is it insignificant. And $120 billion means India will make a significant mark in the value chain from being a very small player now, which is the one slide that Deepak mentioned.
I'm Pranav from Vision Television. I just want to find out, a lot has been said about Taiwanese companies shifting to India, or government interested in supporting that. Do we have any numbers about how much of the Taiwanese companies, chip makers, shifted to India, or the number in terms of the companies who are based in Taiwan, so that we get an understanding about what is the pie of Taiwan contribution to the world and where India could find export market, new market?
Are you talking about electronics or chips?
Chips.
No, chips though, I can't comment on how many Taiwanese companies are coming here or how many are not. That you will know after the ISM and the advisory committee of the ISM finish evaluating the proposals. There are, you must have read in the media, there are some Taiwanese companies that have applied. There are some Taiwanese companies who are showing interest in further applying. But the chip business or the semiconductor mission has declared that India is open for business and investment from all parts of the semiconductor ecosystem. So it is not just Taiwanese companies, it's also the Americans, and it's also the Europeans and all of that. So I can't give you a precise number in that, excepting to say, I think all of the chip companies, all of the geographies will see chip companies and semiconductor companies look at India very actively.
Sir, Prasoon from PTI. My question to ICA is on the Globalise and then Localise slide that you have given, the 3 steps that needs to be taken. In that, one step is lowering and reducing regulatory burden and reducing transport and logistics costs. Can you be specific on what you expect from government in reduction of logistics and transport cost?
See, this is a research report. This doesn't mean that actions are not already on. In fact, I have rarely seen double engine wali sarkar, here is double mantri wali ministry, and both are firing aggressively. And we are seeing that on all aspects of how to manage an industry, everything is, under study. In my opening remarks, I said that we are doing, all the verticals are being studied. The logistic cost, how to become extremely competitive, is also under study. This report gives an input, a further input into that. Now, if you want the granular details of what all is required, I think the Gati Shakti scheme is, a more macro element of this. The future export destinations will have to be very export competitive, right? You can't reduce the size of India because India consumption is everywhere. So that, in fact, the logistic costs will only add to competitiveness as far as consumers are concerned. They'll get more competitive products. But otherwise, for export and for import also, the way the infrastructure is being improved, I think that direction has to be carried on in a very robust manner.
Let me just add one thing there. I just want to say one thing so that there is no ambiguity. The $300 billion target is a target that we are going to hit. We will achieve. We believe, we are very confident that we will achieve. These exercises are about investigating and identifying what are the various strategies, strategic options, and or what are the various, let us say, challenges that need to be met, and what are the proposed solutions for those that the industry is proposing to the government. So I just want to be very clear that we are very clear that the $300 billion target, the $120 billion of export, is something India will do. That is the target the Prime Minister has, Honorable Prime Minister has given the government of India and us, and we will do it. This exercise is really about what are the better options to getting there, what are the other challenges that are there that need to be solved, what kind of policy action will need to be solved. For example, I think some of you asked me in the last press conference, will there be a PLI for components? If this whole thing is about supply chain and it is about deepening the electronics ecosystem, and I said then, yes, it is very, very clear that we will have a very comprehensive support package and support incentive package and a support system, supporting policy framework for the component industry, one of which is semiconductor.
Let me answer that.
I know where this question is coming from, and I know what the proposed headline is, but let me say very clearly, and it is not to do with this press conference, but in general, I have said and the ministry has said that we expect transparent distribution models, we expect this transparency in supply chains, and we expect equitable access to these supply chains from all players in the electronics ecosystem in India. That is just about fairness, openness, and equity. So that is something that I've said outside the context of this press conference. That's the question you asked me, and that's the answer.
Yeah. sir. Sankalp from Bloomberg News. So I have a question on ease of doing business in this sector.
Yes.
You all have worked very hard on this sector. But one of the things that happens sometimes is that, people come, they invest, but there are certain areas of friction. For example, when Pankaj writes to you and says, the issue of royalty is something that agencies don't understand. It's like a lamb befriending a butcher. Or when a company comes here.
Pankaj is a closet poet.
He is. He's quite open actually
Yeah.
about it. But sir, then issues like when we have a dispute with China at the border, Apple's stock gets held up at the ports. So how do you minimize that sort of friction, sir? I want to understand that.
Nobody says India's rise in the electronics ecosystem is going to be without challenges, without a fair share of challenges either internally or externally. These are things that we will address. I mean, I think the point that I am making today on behalf of my colleagues in the ministry and in the rest of the government and on behalf of and partnership with the industry is, we are laser focused on the target and laser focused on this opportunity. This is not, we believe, and I've said this publicly, this is like the Y2K moment in electronics. That this ability to do a step function growth in the electronics GVCs of the world is an opportunity that has been presented to us, to India as an opportunity. And it has been made possible because the Honorable Prime Minister from 14 to 19 rebuilt the electronics ecosystem. Now, if the electronics ecosystem in 2021 was the same one in 2014, this opportunity would have been an academic opportunity for India. So I am saying today that we are laser focused on this. And these reports help us as government and as all of government improve our strategy, improve our policies, improve our own executive administrative action required. And look, I welcome Pankaj and the industry writing to us because we have an open, absolutely open door relationship with the industry. The worst problems, the biggest galis, all of that they can lay on us. And it is our job and duty to address those. Even if it's never been addressed before or it is a first-time problem. So I don't see those as issues. I mean, you saw the display module issue. There was a slight difference of opinion between us and Department of Revenue, and we sat down with them and we resolved it. But that is the all-of-government commitment to making electronics India a success. And that is the thing that I'm hammering again and again and again. This is not just about METI, this is not about Mr. Marwa, me, or Ashwini Vaishnavji or anybody. This is really the government of India, under the leadership of our Prime Minister, saying electronics value chains, in the global electronics value chains are shifting, they are changing, and therefore they represent a very, very serious opportunity for Indian entrepreneurs, foreign companies manufacturing in India, both from a point of view of investments, jobs, and the overall ecosystem, which in turn impacts our new strategic initiatives like semiconductors.
मंत्री जी, ये अपने जो टारगेट बताया 300 बिलियन, तो could I get a breakup? It is a altogether export and domestic market, or it is a export market?
ये डॉक्यूमेंट है, एक कॉपी मैं भेज दूंगा आपको.
I will get it.
हाँ, ये इसका मतलब ये है कि 22-25 लाख करोड़ का इलेक्ट्रॉनिक्स होगा 2026 में.
बहुत बढ़िया.
26 लाख करोड़. उसमें 26 लाख करोड़ का 120 बिलियन यानी कि 10 लाख करोड़ होगा एक्सपोर्ट्स.
सर, मैं राजीव हूँ, दैनिक जागरण अखबार से. सर, मेरा सवाल है कि आप अभी करंट फाइनेंशियल ईयर में $25 बिलियन का एक्सपोर्ट हो जाएगा, उसके बाद 26 तक 120 चला जाएगा. लेकिन सर, फ़ोन जो बाहर की कंपनियां हैं, जो दूसरे देश की कंपनियां हमारे देश में फ़ोन बना रही हैं, वो एक्सपोर्ट में बहुत कम हिस्सेदारी है उनकी, नंबर 1. तो क्या आप उनको एक्सपोर्ट बढ़ाने के लिए कह रहे हैं? दूसरा कि सप्लाई चेन भी वो मोर देन 50% आई थिंक बाहर से डिपेंड करती हैं फ़ोन बनाने में, तो वो सप्लाई चेन यहाँ इस्टेब्लिश करेंगे. तीसरा सवाल ये है सर कि अभी एक खबर चली थी कि 12,000 से कम दाम के फ़ोन के लिए जो है उनको मना किया जा सकता है केवल इंडियन कंपनी को. तो इस पे मैं सर आपका व्यू जानना चाहूँगा.
पहले 2 क्वेश्चन का संक्षिप्त में आंसर है हाँ और हाँ. कि एक्सपोर्ट करना है, हम हर फॉरेन ब्रांड को कह रहे हैं कि आप हमारे देश के कंज्यूमर्स को भी आप बेचिए, लेकिन आप बनाइए इस बेस को एज अ ग्लोबल बेस फॉर सर्विसिंग योर ग्लोबल कंज्यूमर्स. Samsung, Apple, and many companies are doing that. To some of the other older Chinese companies that have been here, I have said the same thing to them, that our expectation is कि आप भी यहाँ से export करेंगे, और उनसे हम मिल भी चुके हैं, और इंडस्ट्री एसोसिएशन ने भी उनको कहा है कि आप भी आपका एक्सपोर्ट यहाँ से करना बहुत ज़रूरी भी है. दूसरा, ये 12,000 का जो है इशू, ऑन दिस आई डोंट वांट टू से एनीथिंग मोर apart from saying that, unfortunately, or no, sorry, I'll say this like this. In our scheme of things, in the government of India scheme of things, there is a space for Indian brands. हम बहुत strongly मानते हैं कि हमारे electronics ecosystem में Indian entrepreneurs, Indian brands, Indian supply chain का भी एक role है. It is not to the exclusion of the foreign suppliers or the foreign brands, but we believe that it is our policy and the government of India's obligation and duty to also build Indian brands. So wherever we feel that there is a crowding out of Indian brands due to unfair trade practices or unfair practices, we will basically, we would like to intervene and make sure that those issues are resolved. But our vision, Prime Minister's vision of electronics is a very, very robust, vibrant, innovative electronics ecosystem that consists of the global majors as well as Indian brands that are viable and happy participants in that ecosystem. There is no such proposal in our ministry, and I can't comment anything further on that.
Thank you. Debarshi from the Straits Times. Can I just request you, I mean, the goal to achieve $120 billion of exports by 2026, that's quite bold. That's almost about more than 7 times increase. So do you want, for someone who has a ringside view from abroad, identify any one event in, let's say, the last 1 year that makes you believe that India is on the right track as far as achieving that goal is concerned? And second, any decision in the pipeline that you feel will add further momentum to India's efforts to achieve that goal?
So to answer your question, the event of this $300 billion and the $120 billion exports, $120 billion exports is not a target that the government assigned. It is what the industry has estimated that they will do. So it's not like some hat from which I pull out a number. So I'm extremely confident, and then of course the ministry and the government has gone through those numbers and understood which player is doing what. And I believe clearly in the post-COVID the new world, or if you want to call it new world order or new GVC or shifting GVCs or changing GVCs or whatever you want to call it, that there is clearly a huge opportunity for countries like India and Vietnam to be a much more significant player in the $1.5 trillion, $1.6 trillion electronics global trade. Number one. Number two, one of the other things about post-COVID, and you wanted one event and I'm giving you 1 or 2 events, is that the digitization of the world is today accelerating. The demand for digital products, digital adoption is at an unprecedented rate, both nationally, domestically, as well as globally. That again leads to, in the context of this trusted value chain concept, for consuming nations and consumers of the world and enterprises of the world to look for viable, sustainable basis to manufacture from, and that is exactly what India today represents.
Domestic value addition. Sir, US has announced US Chips and Science Act, where they are providing $37 billion of incentives for semiconductor manufacturing. Do you see any impact of their program or India's aspiration to have a wafer fab and ecosystem?
Not at all. The India proposition for electronics and semiconductors and that whole category of products is a very, very unique proposition. One of the fastest growing markets in the world, Our own digitization and our own digital consumption, our own digital markets are going to be one of the fastest growing markets in the world. Second is, the fact is that regardless of whether you have a fab in the US or you have fabs in Europe, that Asia will always be a big consumer of semiconductors, and therefore India has positioned itself as the Asia hub for semiconductors and electronics, not in competition with anybody, but given the fact that we have our own strengths. So there's no conflict with the US CHIPS Act, in a nutshell.
Thank you, friends. I also thank you, the Honorable Minister and the representatives of ICRIAR, ICA, and our colleague from the Ministry. Now I formally hand over the floor to the organizers to formally conclude it. Thank you.
I once again thank Shri Rajeev Chandrasekhar, Minister of State, Electronics, IT, Entrepreneurship, Skill Development, Mr. Pankaj Mohindru, Shri S.K. Marwaji, Shri Satendra Prakashji, Mr. Deepak Mishra, other dignitaries from METI, PIB, ICRIAR, ICA, Media and Industry for coming today at the report launch. Now I request everyone to proceed for the high tea on the 4th floor.